We said it before and we'll say it again. We are the ones we've been waiting for. The Love Us campaign allows us to show up for one another. Together, we can fund the healing revolution collectively, one donation at a time. We are proud to have covered the cost of over $6 million in therapy sessions since 2019. But with the demand of our services skyrocketing, we need to do more. As we embark on our 4th year of making mental health resources accessible, we're placing our faith and optimism in our community by setting a bold impact goal. From now until December, we are rallying 1 million supporters to contribute just $5 each. If we succeed, we'll significantly expand our reach and provide $5 billion in therapy to Black women, girls, and non-binary folks in 2025. This campaign is about Black women pulling our resources together to build a grassroots, for us, by us movement. Join the Love Us campaign. Visit the lovelandfoundation.org to join our movement of 1 million by making a $5 donation today. Dr. Ajita Robinson is known as an expert therapist. She is a grief and trauma therapist, best-selling author of The Gift of Grief, a practical guide on navigating grief and loss, international speaker, and income strategist. Dr. Robinson is a licensed clinical professional counselor, trauma, and grief expert. Dr. Robinson embodies excellence in mental health and education. She is a servant leader, involved member in the community, and a born giver. She believes that we all have gifts that are unique to us, and we thrive when we fully lean into those gifts. We find purpose and fulfillment. At her core, she believes that all people have the capacity to overcome adversity. She is living proof that you can start at ground zero and chart a path to excellence that is uniquely yours. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to The Unfolding, presented by the Loveland Foundation. I'm your host, Rachel Keener, and today we are joined by the lovely Dr. Ajita Robinson. Hi, Dr. Ajita.
Hey there, how are you?
Doing good. I must say, I'm very excited for this conversation. Like, working for the Loveland Foundation, we have so many people come to us like seeking support for grief and like year round, but we see it like a high influx of people coming to us during the holiday season, trying to find resources and support for grief. And like after working with you and like seeing all the work you do, like you truly are an expert on grief and like navigating through grief and like creating like resources for that. So I'm just very grateful for you to be in this conversation with us. But I'm curious, like, what drew you to do grief work and like have that be the focus of like what you do?
I love this question for a variety of reasons because I think people are like, oh, I always knew I wanted to do that. I always knew I wanted to be a therapist, but I actually ran away from doing grief work. And when I say ran, I went and got a business degree. I went to law school. I did everything except for be a grief therapist. But what I recognized was I was already a licensed clinician, but I wasn't working directly with grief at the time. And what I realized was that I couldn't do grief work because I had never named my own losses. And it was as a result of doing that work that I was like, this is the thing that I'm supposed to do. And that is what I didn't have the experience doing, that I recognized really quickly that everyone's grieving, right? Not all at the same time, but different things. And I didn't have language to name my grief because nobody had died, right? And that was the piece that I didn't have words for, so I never got, the opportunity to heal around. And it was absolutely the reason I couldn't bear witness to the suffering, but also the healing of others because I didn't know how to do that. And so it really was full circle that came as a result of me doing my own work, that I recognized that I actually was really good at holding space for others as we're navigating life transitions, which for many of us is what grief looks like or what prompts the grief response. And so I think it started with self-discovery that allowed me to become a grief therapist.
No, I want to touch on what you said about like you hadn't experienced loss, but like you still were feeling grief. And I think that like goes to show that like I truly believe that like grief is like the one thing that like truly connects all of us on on this world. And like we all experience it to some capacity, whether it is through loss or something like a transition of some sorts. But I want you to speak more on that. Like what are the different types of grief that aren't just like death sometimes.
Yeah. So grief generally falls in kind of two main buckets, are physical losses and then symbolic losses. Physical losses we recognize, they're those that, they look like tangible losses, the loss of a loved one because they died, the loss of a limb as a result of amputation or accident,
Mm,
physical loss of a home. And so there's a tangible nature to physical loss that we often can recognize. Whereas with symbolic losses, these might be losses that really are intangible to some degree, but your brain doesn't know the difference. The body doesn't know the difference. And so it processes it pretty much the same way. And so some of those symbolic losses include things like loss of identity, loss of safety, emotional, psychological, physical safety, the grief that comes from not having enough money to meet your basic needs. Poverty is traumatic and it causes a
yeah.
grief response. And so those are the symbolic losses that I actually worry about because they're the ones that are likely to accumulate. And they're also most likely the ones to be unsupported, unnamed, and unprocessed. That when that happens are more likely, are likely as a result of the frequency at which they occur to become traumatic or frozen grief. And that really
Mm.
is the unprocessed aspects of grief that compromise safety, again, on all domains. And so I think it's really important for people to understand that grief is not limited to death. And for many of us, it is a lifelong experience that reminds us that we're human, that reminds us that we are still here.
Very human. No, frozen in grief. Ooh, I think grief is always associated with like this like myth of time, and like,
Mhm.
oh, you can just like move through it or like time will heal all wounds. And even if
Mhm.
it's physical or symbolic, like grief, people assume or at least sometimes hope that like, oh, we just need more time to like
Yes,
figure out our feelings. And I think that like as someone who's experienced grief, time is really just like it really does nothing sometimes. Like I think
you're
you
not
learn ways
alone.
to like
Yeah.
yeah, you learn ways to, like, not like, you learn ways to cope better through time, but sometimes, like, I have moments where, like, I feel it just as heavy as the day I lost someone, or sometimes I
Absolutely.
feel like there's seasons of grief where I'm just like, "Oh, I feel like I'm just grieving right now," and I think, like, what you're
Hmm.
saying, like, that symbolic loss, like, people are grieving, like, collectively grieving and, like, individually grieving, and, like, sometimes we're just not talking about it, and we're just, like, grieving in silence or grieving in isolation. I think that's when it gets a little bit, like, muddy or tricky,
Yes,
So, like, how are you
absolutely.
able to, how are you able to, like, use time and use healing in a way that, like, honors grief, no matter, like, what type of grief
Hmm.
it is?
Yeah, I think one of the first things you've kind of mentioned, right, is really kind of disrupting this mistruth that time alone is enough.
Mm.
It isn't, and grief isn't limited to a specific time frame. And really understanding where we as a society even learned that, right? And so many of us have heard of the 5 stages of grief. But what we
Yeah.
didn't realize is that that is taken out of context, that the author, well before, she transitioned, and died, tried to correct the way that the general public was using a model she created for hospice patients. And if we
Oh.
understand that for hospice patients, there is a finality and a finite time that, for the most part, is defined in some way or scope. And so there are stages that might make sense in that context. But for those of us that are not in that context, grief doesn't follow a linear fashion, right? And it we can revisit certain aspects of grief. And in fact, over time, it revisits us. And things
Mm.
like anniversaries,
Yeah.
milestone events, even the ones that are joyful. So I work with clients who have lost a parent. And, let's say you've, lost a parent and then you have a baby. You are
Mm.
excited about this baby. The baby's healthy. But the thing that you will always grieve is that your parent wasn't there to meet that child. So even in the midst of a joyous occasion, the grief will show up. The grief of not having an additional grandparent to love on that child, to help you as you navigate into parenthood for the first time, to commiserate with you about, the losing yourself sometimes in parenthood. That will revisit in times of triumph and celebration, that there's a person missing. There may even be not a person missing, there's a part of myself right? Because
Yeah.
for symbolic losses, some of us lose ourselves in relationships and we have to go back and find us. Sometimes these
Mm,
friendships or even family structures, in order to keep people close, we have to deny our own needs. We get real good at self abandonment, not
yeah.
realizing that we grieve the version of ourselves that had their needs met, that was fully seen and supported. And it becomes such a part of the relationship that we fear that resetting a new boundary means the loss of that relationship. Friendship
Mm,
losses are a big loss for so many
huge.
people,
Yeah.
and a lot of times it is about changing of because we've grown and our identity has changed, our interests have changed, right? Or sometimes our boundaries with that relationship needs to change, and then it falls apart because they were connected to the unhealed version of us that no longer exists. And that's a type of grief that we very rarely talk about, but that we are experiencing over and over and over again, right?
Yeah. No, it's almost like this idea of like you have to grieve someone who's no longer here. And I know you were saying that like grief isn't always death, and this can be like the loss of a relationship, the loss of like an identity, could be the loss of just like even like your hope for the future of like you seeing someone in your life or you seeing a life for yourself and like
Mhm.
really tying that back into it. And just like it
Absolutely.
feels really timely because, I lost my dad about 6 years ago nearly. And my sister, she just had the first baby in our family. And like everything you were saying, like we're so happy and we're so in love with him. And he's really just like this bundle of just so much joy and light. And like, in the same time, you're holding that grief, that weight of
Yeah.
like, oh, like, we really wish like he could be here and be a grandfather. We really wish that like he could have, like, have that relationship with a like, and you wish that like your dad was here for this moments. And like, there's like this grief that you carry with the joy. And I think I've been trying
Mhm,
to find that balance of how to carry grief through all my emotions. Cause I feel like grief
mhm,
is like honestly, like, it's almost like part of my new identity. I'm just someone who will always be grieving. And
mhm.
while that may be like sounds really sad, I don't necessarily mind that, I kind of
Mhm.
feel like I'm surrounded by this like bubble of love always that like I could carry this person or carry these feelings with me as I navigate through life.
Yeah.
So I think that's just like been like the most like eye-opening thing and like one of the blessings in grief that I've
Mhm,
discovered. I think it's interesting because grief is really what brought me to therapy. I remember like after it was
mhm,
like a year after my dad had passed, and I was like, why am I not over it by now? Like I feel
mhm.
like I should be healed. I feel like I should be like not still like sad by this, or I should be like in a different place. But it was just the grief was getting to be so heavy that I was like, maybe I
Yeah.
should talk to someone about this. Maybe I should like work through
Mhm.
these feelings and like it opened up this window of like all these different things that like you kind of like you mentioned like frozen in grief, like all these like
Yeah.
self-abandonment things that like once the one need's not met, then like you just start disabusing all the needs honestly and like you kind of fall into like the spiral. So it's really nice to like
Yeah.
hear that and name that and call that and like able to
Mhm.
grow from that. So yeah, I appreciate
Absolutely. And I love the phrase of growing through that because I think
mm,
we keep being told that we should move on. And that
yeah.
isn't the goal of grief. The goal is to move forward with. And so, how
Mm,
do we move forward with this loss? How do we move forward with the absence of this person's physical presence? And when we're able to do that work, we make it from a place of active grieving, right? All the time, because it'll revisit us, but going to a
yeah.
place of active grieving to honoring. And so, if we can
Mm,
bring them along with us, we get to honor what is no more. We get to honor them in the way that we live moving forward. Many amazing foundations were created as a result of grief. Many of us have heard of the Susan G. Komen Foundation. It was
yeah.
created as a result of someone losing a loved one as a direct result of breast cancer. So
Mm,
that is the purpose, the honoring that we often can have in the aftermath of grief. And if we're lucky, we'll find the grief in the lives that we create post loss. And it doesn't mean we have to forget the person, leave it behind, or pretend that their absence doesn't matter. It means that we choose to live more fully with this loss. And
mm,
sometimes losing a loved one or a relationship really reorients us to what actually matters in life because some of
yes.
us aren't living up to our full potential because we think we have time. But time is a non-renewable energy, and nothing
Yes.
wakes us up to that like death that tells us, like, you know what, I have been doing things that actually don't serve the life that I have. And
Mm,
losing my loved one forces me to confront how I am living. And how do I confront how I'm living in a way that honored whatever they sacrificed? When my grandfather died, one of the last things he said to me is, "You've done enough." I was working
oh,
two, almost three jobs. And as a first generation college graduate, I would not be Dr. Robinson without my grandparents. To the extent my grandmother co signed loans so I could go to my doc program,
wow.
I just wouldn't exist, right? They kept me out of foster care, all the things. And I was paying in a debt that no one told me I owed. But the cost was my quality of life because
Yeah.
I was proving through my work that their sacrifice was worth it. And
Uh,
they had never asked me to repay them. It was a debt I was carrying emotionally and physically and psychologically. And him dying freed me up to live
mm,
life in a way that actually honored what he put in me, right? What he made possible through me. And the best way I could do that was to live a life that honored me because that's all he ever wanted, right? And I don't
exactly.
know that I would have given myself permission to do that without that loss. I would have continued trying to repay that debt unless he directly confronted me with that. And I think him knowing that he was dying gave him room to have a conversation he had been delaying. And so that was the gift, was how I chose to live after losing him, still grieving, right? That
Mm,
there's a lot of things I've accomplished since then, but I'm no longer doing it in a way that's self-sacrificing and that requires me to
mm,
abandon myself. And that's the thing that honors him the most, right? And so I think when
mm.
we can find meaning in the aftermath of loss, it allows us to live more fully while carrying the grief that we undoubtedly would endure for the rest of our lives, right?
He sounds amazing. And just like that gift, like you said, the gift of grief and like the gift of like him like alleviating that weight for you, hopefully. And like
Mhm.
that's such a beautiful thing. And it speaks to him as a person. And sometimes I think about this idea of like grief and gratitude. And like I didn't realize how connected they were until I was grieving
Mhm.
myself. And you spoke on it like there's this power in like that like losing somebody or like having this event that it really does change you. And it changes
Mhm.
the way you see the world and the way you see yourself. And it makes you realize time is so short and it's so limited and we don't have much of it. And so like truly making the most of it. And I found for myself that the way I can make the most of it is by taking a moment to just find like gratitude in like the smallest of
Mhm.
things or smallest of moments. So, like whenever I'm with people who like I really love and care about, I'm just like, I'm so grateful to be in this moment present with
Mhm.
you right now. Because like how
Yeah.
many moments will we have together and like really, but sometimes in that same breath, I find myself kind of stressing out a little bit, thinking like, "Oh, how much long do I have with you?" Like, when like,
Mhm.
I'm kinda just, like, bracing feels like I'm sometimes bracing myself for grief sometimes
Yes.
and how to,
Yeah.
like, navigate through that and being present while not focusing
Mhm.
on, like, the future or, like, being pessimistic of, like, "Oh, this may not last forever," because it won't, but
Yeah.
I can find myself
Yeah.
getting stuck in that sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's a few things there that I'd like to touch on. One being gratitude, and the other being what we're talking about is anticipatory grief that we all
Mm,
experience at some point. But the gratitude piece, one thing that I just want to kind of mention, and I think they do go hand in hand, right? Grief, gratitude, joy. Grief is a full body experience. And so we experience a range of emotions, sometimes simultaneously, oftentimes simultaneously, right? The challenge ends up being is when those other emotions like joy and gratitude and acceptance are enforced as opposed to embraced. Because sometimes,
mhm,
because people are uncomfortable with our suffering, sadness, sorrow, disappointment, anger, they want to move us, self included, because sometimes we do this to ourselves. We want to move ourselves through the necessary aspects of grief and denial and anger and sadness and sorrow to the joy and gratitude and those pieces. And that moving forcefully is harmful when inflicted
mm,
on ourselves and when inflicted on other people. And so, what I often invite people to do is to allow the fullness of grief to show up but to embrace gratitude as it greets you. And it will
Mm.
come and it will go, but it
Yeah.
gives you permission to be where you are, and you get to change your mind, right? As you relate to grief in that moment. There's been moments where I've been absolutely grateful that my grandfather lived life and died on his terms. But there's
Yes.
also the part of me that is angry that he didn't try other things. My grandfather died of cancer that he
Mm.
knew had come back, that he had already decided he was unwilling to go and undergo chemo, and he wasn't going to allow them to operate on him again. Those were his
Yeah.
terms. But the part of me that understands and, that would just like my grandfather to be here was like, well, I wish he would have, right? And
Yeah.
that's the part that, sometimes sneaks up. And I also have to then make amends with that, but that I'm human and that I can still miss him and honor the way he wanted to live his life. And
Yeah.
sometimes they're in conflict. And so I don't force myself and encourage people to not do this, to be gratitude in moments that require me to honor the angst and the grief and the absence, so that when gratitude comes, I can welcome it. And that we
Yeah.
toggle in and out of those things, right? And so I really think that this is about being compassionate companions, and being curious about what we need and what we need to honor as we navigate along this journey, right? And kind of just pay attention to that, without judgment, right? With
Yeah.
the kindness you would give others, try to give to yourself, right?
Mm.
And and as we talk about the other piece that kind of popped up was when we're around people that we love and people where we feel safe and we're making memories, it can remind us that I won't always have this time. And that can make us anxious about what is to come. Well, what we're talking about is anticipatory grief. And sometimes we think about this when it comes up most commonly is when we know someone has a diagnosis that's terminal. But
Mm.
that's also related to physical loss. What you're
Yeah.
talking about is the symbolic loss that precedes the physical time because of work, because of moving across the country, because we got married, because we had a baby. We might become to anticipate that we may not be able to spend this amount of time with our friends, or they have new jobs or what have you, things that we're excited about, but that may
Yeah.
change the quality and frequency of those interactions. But it also can remind us that, hey, I know with certainty that at some point I'm going to die. And that can create a lot of angst. And what I say, it will rob us of the current joy because we're borrowing trouble from the future and we have no control or agency there. And so, what I
Yeah.
would like to invite myself to do is that I actually have the ability to enjoy them right now. That is the only thing I have control over. And I know I can make that a good experience from my end. I can honor them in this moment so that when they are no longer here, they know exactly how I felt about them and how important they were. There's none of the unsaid and undone that often cause us to suffer and grief because we had unfinished business with the deceased. And so we actually get to make amends and honor now so that we don't have to do that work when we no longer have the opportunity to tell them how we feel about them, what they mean to us, that we love them, that they're important. We get to do it in the details today. And so
Yeah.
again, it is an invitation to live more intentionally with the people you care about. So pick up the phone and call that person that keeps showing up on your mind, that you busy
Mm-hmm.
your way through. Oh, I'll call them tomorrow. Call them today. Right.
Say, no, all you have is this moment and like this idea of giving people their flowers while they're still here, and like making sure that like you let them know how much you care and love them. Like my rule is if anyone ever like crosses my mind, I'll just send them a text saying, "Hey, thinking of you," like just to just make sure it gets out there and like they know that like I'm.
Mhm.
One thing I want to know is more so about how can people support those who are grieving? And I know that like there's always like when someone like loses somebody, there's like "Oh, I'm sorry for your loss," and like that seems like the right thing to say, but the wrong thing to say at the same time. But
Mhm.
also, how do people support people who are grieving like much longer after that loss happened? Like how do you be a support system years pass or decades past
Mhm.
even? How can you show up in those
Mhm.
ways?
And so I teach a very simple framework to people who are not clinicians. And it's a little
Mm.
bit of an extended framework if you are a helper or a healer, because we have more responsibility to help guide people through their grief journey. But the everyday person can act. That's the acronym ACT. Acknowledge the loss, be a compassionate companion, give them room to talk or a tool. And so all of us can do this, right? You don't have to be a therapist. You don't have to be a healer. And so I'll go into a little bit more detail about what each of those means. So the first piece, A, acknowledge the loss. Sometimes we don't name that. I'm sorry you lost your dad. I'm sorry that your dad died, because I don't know what to say. And I don't want to bring it up if you don't bring it up, because I don't want to remind you or trigger you. Well, the person grieving has never forgotten. It's kind of playing like a sound of, background noise in their day to day. They've never forgotten it. What we've become accustomed to is that our world got really quiet and everyone else went about their day. And so you saying, hey, I know it's your dad's birthday or the anniversary of his death, and I am very sorry that he's no longer here. Acknowledge the loss in the present moment when it happens and for years down the road, because it's always going to be present for them, right? The C, compassionate companionship. I like to use the example of if someone asks you to come take a walk with them, right? And you're joining them on their walk, we generally let the person who invited us set the pace. And so we walk alongside them, we match their gait and their stride, and usually we're having a conversation that's at their pace. And a compassionate companion comes right alongside folks, and sometimes it's just sitting on the couch and being present, but we let them lead the pace at which they're moving. And we might get a second wind and move a little faster and then go a little slower. Either way, I'm going right along with you. I'm not moving you from where you are to where I want you to be. I'm just going to be present with you. And I'm going to do that while not judging what your pace is. I'm doing that in a way that remains open and empathic, right? And intentional. And so oftentimes people who are grieving, they may not need you to do anything. They need to be seen, heard, and held. And so the quality of your relationship determines the extent to which you do that. So this is different than if you're an employer versus that's your good girlfriend. The level at which you show up matches the relationship that you have, right? And then the T is talk or tool. Those are interchangeable. I often give people room to talk before I offer them a tool. And I'll give an example.
Please.
In the immediate aftermath of someone dying, they may need to just tell you what happened. And this is on their terms, right? And so I don't interrupt that stream of consciousness where they need to just be heard. But somewhere in the conversation, oftentimes it happens because we ask them, how can I help you? How can I support you? And what often happens is the person grieving says, I don't know. And we're like, okay, well, let me know if anything comes up. Now, we've just transferred that to them. And so we're asking them to tell me how I can be a companion because we're not sure, right? And the goal is to really honor them. But I want you to think about what things they may actually need. So when I was in the process of burying my grandfather, I had never written an obituary. And so my best friend, we've been friends for 26 plus years. I won't tell my age. We've been friends for a real long time. Right? We've been friends for a really long time. And she says, hey, I can call the florist. Everyone knows that if you're having a funeral, well, not everyone, but she has known me long enough to know that we're going to need flowers for the funeral, that we're going to need the program printed. She did the task, right? The tools that I would need. I didn't know what type of flowers I wanted, but she had florists lined up when I had that answer to her question, right? She had a printer lined up when I figured out the obituary because she could focus on what I might need next because I didn't have the capacity to think through. I have to go home and tell my grandmother, her husband has died. And so I'm stuck in the moment of grieving. I can't tell you how to help me. And we want to be careful by assigning the support to the griever. And so I often teach people to let them talk. And then what tools might you desire for yourself if you were in that position? Or what might people navigating a divorce or the death of a loved one need? And you can Google this. ChatGPT is a wonderful tool that might give you some ideas. But what we don't want to do is to assign another task to the person grieving. And so those are some of the tools. It may be that you look up a therapist that specializes in helping someone that's navigating divorce, right? Which is one of the number one triggers of grief in this country. At the
Really?
rate at which we experience it is navigating the divorce, helping the kids do that, right? Figuring out what your identity is post loss, because it's one of the biggest life transitions that most adults will face.
Mm, that makes sense.
And so that might be finding a therapist, a local support group, right? I don't have to ask you that. I might just, say, hey, I found a therapist if you want to talk to someone. I also get to normalize that people talk to therapists in times of grief, right? The aftercare, because you mentioned, what about years down the line? That might look like at Thanksgiving, do we want to set a plate for your loved one this year? Because they may have been doing this last year, but this year they're ready to pick the plate up. So we're just asking, right? Is there anything that you want to do to honor your brother or to honor whatever this is? You have an anniversary coming up. And if you know this person, you might have ideas, right? So I go to visit my brother. That's something that my friend has offered to do with me. Or she's like, hey, do you want to grab French fries, which are my favorite love language, right? To the cemetery. Right. Because she may not go with me to the cemetery, but she wants to be there in the aftermath to offer support, right? And so I think being able to recognize that people need support in the aftermath and making yourself available for that. We have had people set up meal trains because the thing that grieving people often don't do is remember to eat. And so these are the logistics we know everyone needs, right? And so those are the types of things that I recommend folks think about. And so acknowledge the loss, compassionate companionship, talk, or tool. And so most of us can navigate and honor folks using one of those, and sometimes more than one, right? But it gives us a starting place.
No, that's beautiful. It makes me curious on what does self-care look like for grief, because that was like the support system, how to like be supportive of someone who's moving through grief. But like as someone who's experiencing the grief firsthand, how can you really take care of yourself and not lean into the self-abandonment that you were speaking on? Like how can you really take care of like your own needs and make sure that your needs are being met by yourself and like filling your cup while you're going through such an event?
Mm-hmm. I think one is being able to kind of just honor that it is normal and natural for you to have a variety of emotions, that they are normal, right? And so one of the things that we can do is to not criticize ourselves. We have this wonderful way of being harsh with us in ways that we wouldn't be with other people. And so make sure that that self-dialogue passes your best friend test, right? If you would say it to your best friend, okay, would you allow someone else to say it to your best friend, right? Because there's some things I can say to my best friend that you can't say to my best friend, right? And so does it pass those two filters? I can say it, you can't say it. And so does it pass the 2-layer BFF test? Then you probably, if it doesn't, then it's probably not a good thing to say to yourself. So the internal language that we're speaking often gets in the way. The second thing that I would say is some of us are really good at helping others, but we are terrible at being on the receiving end of help. And so I just want you to practice saying yes to the right people. So some people may be offering support and they're not people that are safe for you to take support from. So we can still be discerning. But the people who love you, that are good to you, when they ask you if you need help, say yes. You don't have to know what kind of help you need. Just give yourself permission to receive. And so people can do that and show up for you if you just name that you're not okay. And that we don't have to wait until it's all falling down to speak to a therapist, right? We can do it even on the days we feel okay, right? That it's a full body experience. So pay attention to yourself. Sometimes grief manifests as inability to sleep. We lose creativity. We have a difficult time focusing. We have pain in our hip, in our neck, in our chest. The body doesn't differentiate. And so what is happening with grief is it's a psychological and emotional wound, and the body is geared towards survival. And so this is the reason that grief that you've been pushing away, it shows up when you go on vacation, because you finally had enough resources, right, from not busying yourself away. And your brain's like, hey, you have a little bit of downtime. Look at this. And it brings it
like, oh, you're relaxed?
Moments. Yeah, you got a little free time. Here you go. And you're like, wait a minute. I'm trying to vacation here, but you have some unfinished work that is keeping you from fully repairing, right? And so give yourself permission to receive, be kind to yourself, and give yourself permission to change your mind. What you need in the immediate aftermath of grief may not be what you need 5 years down the road. Remain curious about what serves you, what honors you, and allow people to be on that journey with you. We're not supposed to do this alone. And so give yourself permission to have support.
Oh, I love that concept of we're not meant to do it alone, because community is so important, especially like in general, but especially while grieving, and like having people to lean on who are trust and safe and giving you that soft landing, like no matter what type of grief you're experiencing, having someone to share that with is really like life changing and like so special. I wonder, what are like healthy coping strategies people can use to like grieve, would you say? Like ways to, it probably expands more on the self-care, but like examples of coping strategies, so to speak.
Absolutely. So for folks who have some things unsaid, sometimes we write letters to the deceased or to people who may not be in your life anymore. They've not died, because oftentimes what we're struggling with is the undone. And so journaling helps with this. Letter writing helps with this. Some of us, have done things in the honor of our loved ones, right? I started a foundation for my brother. And so many of us are active in our grief, right? But if we talk about us, some of that, what I'm saying is honoring the loss. But for us, give yourself permission to give good rest. Again, the brain and the body need to survive. The body repairs itself when you sleep. And so hydrating yourself, getting good sleep. This may mean, I got myself a new bed when I was feeling grief in my body. I got one of those nice little fancy adjustable mattresses, because I knew that I needed to do the task of grief, right? But I didn't have to have a bad night's sleep because I had a bad mattress, right? And I had never known how expensive they were, because my grandfather always bought my mattresses, right?
Great.
So again, I knew I had emotional and psychological work to do, but I could address the physical manifestation of grief. And that was one way I took care of myself. Doing hot yoga, which I absolutely do not enjoy. My body needed what hot yoga does, right? And so it needed the physical, right? I absolutely do not enjoy hot yoga. I keep trying to make myself enjoy it. I enjoy it.
I want to like it.
Yoga, right? I want to like it. It is silk press, not friendly. It's just not my vibe, right? But what do we need? What are we noticing our body needs from a physical perspective, emotional, psychological, spiritual, right? Emotional. Those are the things. And that looks different for me and for you, right? One of the other things that I had to do, I told you I was working 2.5 jobs. One of the things I needed to do was to give myself breathing room financially, because that was a thing that I wasn't even aware of. I was grieving was financial insecurity. But what it really was that I had fear and around money. And I really had fear around success. And so I had to develop better financial habits that gave me financial security, because I was grieving the gap in that, right? And so sometimes it's a matter of identifying what is the gap, right? And building in things that buffer that. I oftentimes knew that I needed to be in community with people, because being by myself was really too hard of a place to be in the immediate aftermath. And so that meant that I would have dinner with friends. And so I would host dinner. We'd all bring a dish a couple of times a week, because that's what I needed was community, because I was suffering in isolation, but I didn't have to, because my friends were willing to show up. And so it wasn't always the same friends, but it was about me issuing the invitation. And so it really was of allowing myself to be in community around a need that I had. It gave me room to do the work when I was alone, right? And so it gave me a bit of a floor to the grief. Therapy is always going to be a recommendation. It gives you a safe space where no one needs you. You don't have to be in charge. You don't have to have the answers. It's a safe space. It's just about taking care of you. And then the last piece that I think gets in a way for a lot of people that impacts their grief on a day-to-day basis is there's something in your environment that's maintaining the dysfunction and the sorrow. For me, my bedroom is always a representation of how I'm doing emotionally and psychologically. If it's chaotic, I'm overextended, I'm stressed. And so one thing that I did was, I had to have someone come in and help me reset my bedroom. And that was really hard to do because I pride myself on being organized and being clean and what have you. And it wasn't that. It was like, hey, you wouldn't tell someone that has had cardiac surgery to not go to physical therapy, right?
Yeah.
Someone that's struggling for grief, that it's very easy to be depressed and anxious and not have the energy to clean up. Why wouldn't I ask someone to come help clean my house so that I start with a fresh plate? Right. And so we
Exactly.
have to, again, think about the judgment we might be placing on seeking help in whatever domain it's in. And so those are the things that I find to be most critical. Everything else you can kind of ad lib, right?
Yeah. That's how you move through grief. It's just like allowing yourself the space and like the time to just like figure out what you need in that moment and like having, like you
In that
said,
moment.
permission to give yourself that freedom and then like have that help
Mm,
because we're not meant to do this alone. It's a very hard
yeah.
thing. No,
Absolutely. And I really like
uh,
the phone a friend, you know,
yes.
phone a friend, right? That goes back to the talk piece. It's like, hey, my best friend sent me a message earlier today and she says, hey, Pumpkin, I was thinking about you. How are things going? And I just almost responded and said, hey, I'm fine. And that in that moment wasn't true, right? I woke up to a
Mhm.
sick kid and a whole bunch of things that were happening. And with this person, I can actually say today's probably a 4 out of 10 day, right? Or something of that
Honestly.
nature. Sometimes it's just being honest, right? And in that moment, I probably would have said I'm fine because I didn't know what she had going on and I don't want to add to her plate. But she checked in on me. And so I just have to be honest, and then she can decide what capacity she has to bear witness. And so what I did was I said, hey, do you have about 5 minutes to chat? Because that's really all I needed, right? Is
Yeah.
someone that I knew would bear witness to what it is that I'm saying. I am very grateful and privileged for the life that I have. And I still have things that are not okay in my world. And I need someone that I can say that to without feeling unappreciative, ungrateful, any of those things because she's a safe space for me, right? And I think that piece is important. So phone a friend, if that's something, phone your pastor, phone, whomever is in your network that will love on you.
Yes. No, that's and like that idea of not like free of judgment and like really just a chance to be vulnerable and a chance to just be like, hey,
Hmm.
here's what's going on. And like you said, if they have capacity, they could like let you know and like give you that space and like back and forth. But no, I can
Yeah.
like talk to you all day. I know our time is wrapping up, but I wanted to talk to you more about you mentioned self-discovery and it's funny you mentioned that because that's actually our theme for the year on Unfolding is like how does self-discovery play a role in your healing? And I think with you, how does self-discovery play a role in healing, especially healing with grief?
Hmm. And so I think it plays a big role because again, we've talked about this self-abandonment piece, which triggers grief for many of us. And so I always ask people to kind of inquire just for themselves, who would you be if not for who you had to become? Because
Mm,
oftentimes it is the gap in that leaves us not knowing ourselves, right? I know that I became a grief and trauma therapist, but I thought I was going to be an attorney. And had I stayed on that path, I would have become an attorney. I did well academically, all the things, but it would have been in spite of who I was called to be if I wasn't hiding from my own grief. And so that piece around who might I be if not for who I had to be? Because so many of us are in jobs out of survival, in relationships for the same reason. And that is not
mm.
the best or highest level of ourself. And so it really starts with being curious about, is there anything I need to unlearn? Is there anything I need to unpack so that I can return to myself? And what might that look like? And so I think we really are in a space of returning to self, your most authentic self, the part of you that feels most loved and that feels seen and cared for unapologetically. That's the part that we want to highlight and to center in your life.
Oh, I love that. It's so fun to like learn about yourself and like remember the things that, like make you happy, but also discover new things that you enjoy or that bring you peace.
Hmm.
And that whole idea of like, who would you be without like worrying about like all the things that impact like who you have to become and like
Yeah.
that core part of you and like pouring into that core and like allowing yourself to like imagine all these possibilities is so beautiful. I know people are listening to this and probably going to know, where can I find her? How can I support her? And I want to give you that space to like let them know all the ways that Dr. Ajita is around.
Absolutely. So I am on all social media networks, but I mostly hang out on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram. And you can find me at Dr. Ajita Robinson on all of those platforms. And my website is ajitarobinson.com. And so hopefully that will be linked below or above, wherever this will be. But that's really where I hang out. So feel free to engage in conversation, ask good questions, and just be in community.
Beautiful. And also the gift of grief.
Yes. I do have a book called The Gift of Grief, a practical guide on navigating grief and loss. And so that's available wherever books are sold, but it's also available directly on my website.
Yes. Well, thank you so much. I'm so grateful that you're able to join us and have this beautiful conversation. I know it's going to like hit people at the right time and like be a place of like support and comfort and like a safe space. So we're just so grateful to have you here.
Thank you for making room for this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you all for joining us for a very special episode of The Unfolding, presented by the Loveland Foundation. At the Loveland Foundation, we are committed to showing up for communities of color in unique and powerful ways, with a particular focus on Black women and girls. Our resources and initiatives are collaborative and they prioritize opportunity, access, validation, and healing. Since our founding, the Therapy Fund has provided financial support for therapy to over 13,000 Black women, girls, and non-binary individuals across the country. This year, our goal is to provide free therapy to at least 6,000 more. If you'd like to join us and invest in generational change, visit our website at thelovelandfoundation.org for ways to give. To stay updated on new episodes and any future programming, follow us on Instagram and Meta, or check out our website at thelovelandfoundation.org.